Hi guys, I'm over here and welcome back to a series that I have not touched for a really long time now, but I definitely want to get back into, especially with the new addition of my new bookshelf. And I just came, while I was putting all the books on this bookshelf, I came across a lot of books that I know I want to do dramatic readings for. And so, welcome to another fine edition of, dramatic readings and personal stories, where I tell you guys the story behind the books, my personal experience with the books, and then do a dramatic reading of them. So today we are going to be reading Clue, The Case of the Invisible Cat, book number 3 in the Clue book series. Now I'm pretty sure that a lot of you watching this didn't know that Clue was a book series, because I didn't even know it was a book series when I spotted this at the Bookworm Festival in Pennsylvania a while back. I knew that Clue was a board game, and I knew that Clue had a movie, but I didn't know it had a book series, so I was very much intrigued by this. So if I enjoy this and like it, I might look for some more. So let's get into it. Exciting mini-series based on the best-selling Parker Brothers game. Book created by A.E. Parker. Oh, so is he like the actual same Parker that created the game? Because that would be cool if it was written by the same Parker Brothers that created the game. And there's the inside cover. Okay, and here is the list of the other books in the series. There's Who Killed Mr. Body? Well, because that's like if you've read the back of a box of Clue, then you know that that's the whole premise of the game. Or if you've seen the Clue movie. The Secret Passage, The Case of the Invisible Cat, that's what we're reading today, and The Mystery at the Masked Ball. So those sound really cool, and if I enjoyed this, then I will definitely try to find those up somewhere. I wonder if they're at the library. I'll have to check that out. Okay, Clue, The Case of the Invisible Cat. Book created by E.A. Parker. Written by Eric Weiner. Oh. I might sound like a little bit of a doofus here, but what's the difference between creating a book and writing a book? I guess creating the book would be like they design the pictures and decide like the format of the book and stuff, whereas writing the book is just the story. Maybe that's like the editor or something. And based on characters from the Parker Brothers games, a creative media applications productions. Scholastic Inc., New York, Toronto, London, Auckland, and Sydney. Special thanks to Thomas Dunsbury, Julie Ryan, Lara Milholland, I think, Jean Furrow, Greg Halch, Donna Smith, Nancy Smith. I wonder if they're sisters. John Simcoe and Elizabeth Parisa. Alright, for Matthew and Andrew. That's kind of funny because it's a common name. I was going to say I know 2 people named Matthew and Andrew, but it's a very common name, so that's not actually a big deal. Anyway, so let's get on to the actual story. Okay, first of all, let's just enjoy this lovely illustration. It's like the actual board game of Clue, so if you wanted to, you could pull out the board game and play along. Okay, so let's do this. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Reginald Body, and I'm your host for the weekend. please give your bags and your weapons to my maid, Mrs. White. I have no intention of being murdered again. I should probably explain about that. It seems that during your previous visit, one of the other guests accidentally shot me 3 times. Everyone thought I was hit, but as it happens, I had just swallowed some snake venom antidote. That was what knocked me cold. Never mind. I'm fit as a fiddle now. Well, enough about that. The important thing is that you're here, and that this time there won't be any ghastly crimes. Knock on wood. Not a single one, I promise you. But, just in case there is a crime, would you mind keeping a lookout? Watch for clues, that sort of thing. Then tell me who committed the crime. Okie doke. You have only 6 suspects to worry about. I, of course, will never be a suspect. But that would be quite an awesome twist if he was the murderer. I mean, in one of them. The 6 suspects are Colonel Mustard, a dashing gallant who's always ready to fight a duel. In fact, I often find that when I'm around the Colonel, I'm dashing too. Dashing the other way. Mrs. Peacock, what can one say about this prim and proper lady? Whatever it is, you'd better mind your manners. Miss Scarlet, what a stunning woman. At least it was stunning when she hit me with the lead pipe. Professor Plum, once you meet the professor, you'll never forget him. On the other hand, he never remembers a thing. Mrs. White, my maid, is always cheerful, always wearing a smile. Why she loves being in the kitchen, sharpening the knives. Mr. Green, all right, so this businessman is a bit of a bully. There are worse things he could be, and he's been all of them. And he's here why? Don't worry, I'll give you a chart of the suspects, weapons, and rooms at the end of each mystery. As you read, you can check off the suspects until you've narrowed your list down to 1. But as I say, all of this will be totally unnecessary, because this time there isn't going to be a murder. There isn't going to be any trouble, and there won't be any screams coming from the hall. Did I just hear screams coming from the hall? Excuse me a moment, would you? Chapter 1. So that was just the introduction, wow. So I guess that part right there is in front of every book, only switched up to get you up to speed with any of the previous books. That's what I suppose anyway. But Chapter 1, a mixed bag. There was a loud knock on the front door of Mr. Body's mansion. Mrs. White, the maid, hurried to open it. Before her stood a tall, dashing gentleman in a yellow cap, yellow coat, and yellow boots. "Colonel Mustard," said Mrs. White with a broad smile. "It's always a pleasure to see you." As the Colonel strode past her, Mrs. White's smile changed to a snarl. "It would be an even greater pleasure not to see you," she muttered under her breath. "Let me take your bag," she said aloud, reaching for the Colonel's black leather suitcase. But her hand never reached it. Mustard whipped out a revolver and fired 3 times. Mr. Body raced in. He found the Colonel with his revolver raised high in the air. His monocle was quivering. So was Mrs. White. "Those were warnings. Those were just warning shots," explained Colonel. "But let this be a lesson to you, and to anyone else who tries to touch my suitcase. This weekend, this bag is filled with priceless statues that I collected abroad while serving in the army. I'm meeting a buyer here on Sunday, and I don't intend to lose my fortune to a thief." He glared at Mrs. White. "Thief?" echoed Mrs. White, shocked. "Calling me a thief?" "Calling me a thief?" shouted the Colonel, waving his revolver. "I challenge you to a duel." Hold on, Mustard. "You called her a thief," explained a worried-looking Mr. Body. "Did I? Well, in that case..." Mustard put away the revolver and headed for his room, clutching his suitcase with both hands. Just then, there was another knock at the door. Mrs. White opened it. Outside there stood a beautiful woman in a dark red coat with bright red rouge on her cheeks. "Mrs. Scarlet!" gasped Mrs. White. "You look so beautiful." "Well, don't sound so surprised," snapped Miss Scarlet. "I always look beautiful. Take my bag. And be careful with it. It's filled with gold coins from one of my many rich admirers." Mrs. White nodded with a smile that changed to a scowl when Miss Scarlet's back was turned. She lugged the heavy suitcase to Miss Scarlet's room. As it happened, the suitcase was black leather, and identical to Colonel Mustard's. The moment Miss White dropped the suitcase next to Miss Scarlet's bed, the door knocker knocked again. She raced downstairs. The bespectacled Professor Plum stood outside in a purple coat, purple bow tie, and purple polka dot underwear. "Professor," began Mrs. White, reddening, you have seemed to have forgotten your pants." Plum looked confused. "Not at all," he said. "They're in my suitcase." Mrs. White stared at the suitcase. It was made of black leather. In fact, it looked exactly like Colonel Mustard's and Miss Scarlet's. Professor Plum waited for Mrs. White to carry the suitcase away. "Don't worry," the maid told him. "I won't take your suitcase, I promise." "You won't take my suitcase?" asked the professor. "That's rather odd. Why won't you?" "Well," said Mrs. White, "I just thought you might have priceless values in there or something." No, said Plum. "My pants were on sale." Then a puzzled look came across his face. Come to think of it, I can't remember what else is in there." He handed the black suitcase to Mrs. White. Her arm nearly fell off as the suitcase crashed to the floor. "Ah, yes. Now I remember what's inside," said Plum. "Fossils." "Fossils?" asked Mrs. White. "Yes, a big batch of rare rocks I found on a recent dig. So rare, in fact, that they're worth over $1 million. These people. Shall I have Mr. Body put them in the safe?" "No, I'd rather keep the suitcase with me, if you don't mind," Plum said. "Put it in my room." "Right," agreed Mrs. White. It took her 20 minutes to drag the suitcase to the professor's room. Then she hurried back to the hall to answer the door again. This time it was Mr. Green. He was wearing a cucumber green coat and a pepper green tie and an olive green hat. Now that's what I call dressing," said Mrs. White, complimenting Green's green clothes. "Salad dressing," she added under her breath. Unfortunately, Mr. Green heard her. "Don't insult me," he grumbled, "or I'll—" He raised a wrench in the air. "You'll what?" said Mrs. White, holding up the candlestick. "No fighting, please," begged Mr. Botty as he rushed back into the hall. Mr. Green and Mrs. White slowly lowered their weapons. "Here, take my bag, would you?" Mr. Green told Mrs. White. "And be sure you put it in the right room. It's only got about $1 million worth of stocks and bonds in it." Mrs. White nodded and dragged the suitcase from the hall. As luck would have it, the suitcase was black leather, just like the others. Is there anyone in this mansion right now that's not filthy rich? Mrs. Peacock was the last guest to arrive. She smiled at Mrs. White as the maid opened the door. Mrs. White didn't know she was smiling, though. Mrs. Peacock's blue coat was modestly buttoned up to her forehead. Oh, so I guess there's a big collar or something. Interesting. After Mrs. Peacock had undone the buttons, she handed Mrs. White her black leather suitcase. By sheer chance, the suitcase looked exactly like all the others. Mrs. Peacock handed over the bag. The contents shifted slightly with a clink of glass and a slosh of liquid. "What's inside?" asked Mrs. White, arching one eyebrow in surprise. "What's inside?" Mrs. Peacock blushed blue. "Oh, dear, I'm afraid I can't tell you. It wouldn't be proper to say the word aloud." Really? Mrs. White shrugged. "Of course." She smiled politely, then turned away and rolled her eyes as she carried Mrs. Peacock's bag to her room. Meanwhile, outside the mansion, darkness began to fall. Within a few hours, okay, can I just say this real quick? Why did they put within a few hours twice in a row? I mean, I get it, you want to space it here for a dramatic effect, but then don't put it here. I just feel like that doesn't seem right. Within a few hours, it was pitch dark. The guests were asleep, and all was quiet at Mr. Body's mansion. Too quiet. Then a floorboard creaked, and creaked again. One of Mr. Body's guests was tiptoeing through the hallway toward Mr. Green's room. In one hand, the guest carried a black leather suitcase. Well, that narrows it down. Not. The guest found Mr. Green sleeping with his black suitcase clutched in his arms. Gently, the guest pried Mr. Green's fingers loose from the bag, pulling one finger at a time. Luckily, Mr. Green didn't wake up. But when the guest tried to pry the last finger away, Mr. Green suddenly stopped snoring. "Stop, Mama!" he shouted. "Please, don't take away my toy." The guest waited. Soon Mr. Green started snoring again, and the guests carefully switched the bags. Mr. Green grasped the new bag tightly. "Thank you, Mama," he murmured dreamily. "You're quite welcome," the thief told him with a sneer. 1 minute later, Mrs. White tiptoed into Miss Scarlet's room. As it happens, Mrs. White was carrying a black leather suitcase of her own. This bag was also identical to all the others. Miss White used it to store extra feather dusters. "I hate to part with my feather dusters," she whispered to the sleeping Miss Scarlet, "but I've decided to swap my bag with you for your gold coins. Call me crazy." She smiled wickedly, but when she began to search the room, her smile faded fast. Miss Scarlet's black bag was nowhere to be found. "Where did you hide it, you vain thing?" the maid muttered. She slowly opened the closet door, trying to keep it from squeaking. Inside hung 30 expensive scarlet dresses. But no black bag. Mrs. White glanced at Miss Scarlet. She was still sleeping peacefully, her head resting on a large black pillow. A black pillow? Mrs. White did a double take. Miss Scarlet was sleeping on her suitcase. Mrs. White thought for a moment. Then she crouched down behind the headboard. She reached into the pocket of her white nightgown and found a bobby pin. She threw the bobby pin at the window. It rapped against the glass. "Who's there?" demanded Miss Scarlet, sitting bolt right up in bed. "1 second. Okay, good. We're all plugged in now. My battery was running low. Alrighty, where were we? Seeing no one, Miss Scarlet settled right back down and fell asleep again, her head once again resting on the black leather suitcase. But it wasn't the same black leather suitcase. Mrs. White had switched the bags. At the exact same instant that Miss Scarlet sat bolt upright in bed, Professor Plum sat bolt upright in his bed. "I've just remembered something," he said aloud. "My fossils are worth less than $1 million. In fact, they're just plain worthless." Okay. Then he remembered something else. He remembered that Mr. Green's suitcase was filled with $1 million worth of stocks and bonds. He tiptoed into Green's room, pried Green's fingers loose, and switched the bags. When Professor Plum tiptoed backward out of Mr. Green's room, carrying the black leather suitcase, at the same time Mrs. White tiptoed backward out of Miss Scarlet's room, carrying the black leather suitcase she had just stolen. Both Plum and White tiptoed quietly. They didn't make a sound, but they tiptoed right into each other. The two thieves screamed and dropped their bags. "Why don't you watch where you're going?" cried the professor, grabbing one of the suitcases. "I'm sorry, sir," mumbled Mrs. White, grabbing the other suitcase. "What are you doing up so late?" demanded Professor Plum. I couldn't sleep," the maid stammered. "So I went for a little walk." "With a suitcase?" Yes. I thought it might be a long walk." Then she saw the suitcase in the professor's hand. "But what about you? What are you doing up so late with a suitcase?" The professor thought quickly. "The same reason as you. Good night." He headed for his room, but he had taken the wrong bag. Mrs. White headed for her room as well, but all the arguing had finally roused Mr. Green. When Mrs. White turned the corner, she bumped right into him. Mr. Green was holding the wrench. He closed it on Mrs. White's nose. "Give me back my bag, or your nose will never run again," he growled.
"But it's not your bag,"
said the maid in a pinched nasal voice. "Do you have a cold?"
"No, it's the wrench."
"Oh." Mr. Green kept the wrench on her nose, however, as he snatched the suitcase. He flicked it open. Inside the suitcase lay bottle after bottle of blue mouthwash, 10 in all. "What? This isn't my bag!"
"That's what I've been trying to tell you,"
said Mrs. White. Mr. Green's angry face collapsed into tears. "I'm ruined!" he blubbered. "Ruined! Who stole Mr. Green's suitcase?" So, is this like the overall mystery, or is it each chapter it's going to have its own mystery leading up to the big mystery? Well, is this the end of the chapter? Okay, so it is like each um, chapter is its own mystery, and it's leading up to one mystery, I suppose. So, first of all, before I read the actual solution, let's go over what we know. And also post your comments below telling me what you guys think. Who do you think stole Mr. Green's suitcase? Okay, so let's recap first of all. Actually, let me get a pen or a pencil so I can fill out the little clue notebook thing right here. Nope. Where'd I put that pen? Where'd I put that pen? Ah, here it is. Will this work? Yes, it will. Okay. Alrighty. So, let's go over what we know. Okay, there's some protection to all the characters. Well, first of all, let's get the obvious out of the way. Obviously, Mr. Green didn't steal Well, I guess he could have stolen his own bag, hid it, and then try to frame someone else. But I don't think this book is going to go that deep into detail and try to do that complex of a mystery. So I'm just going to assume that Mr. Green did not steal his own bag and is framing someone else so they get in trouble so he can get revenge on them or something. So I'm just going to put a little X right there. Okay, so Mr. Green, we're assuming, didn't steal his own bag. So then Mrs. White is in Miss Scarlet's bedroom and steals Miss Scarlet's suitcase. And she switched them. And she switched it with her one that's full of feather dusters, which is kind of weird. Why would you keep feather dusters in a suitcase? If I were going to store feather dusters somewhere, I would store them where their feathers could breathe and not get crushed. But that's just me. So assuming that that's actually what's in her bag, then it wouldn't be her. But what if? Can we really trust what the book tells us? That's the thing. Like, are we going to assume, oh, who's ever telling the story is in the right? Because if I could know for sure that the perspective that we are hearing the book from, or getting the information from the books from, then I would know for sure, oh, Miss White is innocent. I think we're supposed to assume that Miss White is innocent because she didn't have bag. Because obviously the mouthwash suitcase is Miss Scarlet's suitcase and not Mr. Green. So I don't think it's Miss White. Wait, no, Miss Scarlet didn't have the mouthwash in hers. She had the gold coins. So maybe Mrs. White isn't. No, because still, Mr. Green didn't have the mouthwash. I think the mouthwash was in... Who was the one that said... that had the liquid in her, bag, but she was like, oh, I'd rather not say it out loud. Okay, that was Mrs. Peacock. So I think the suitcase with the mouthwash in it was Mrs. Peacock's. That would make sense. I mean, she's the only one whose contents of the suitcase we don't know for sure. I mean, can we really say we know any of the contents of the suitcases for sure? I mean, we never, like, saw inside any of them. So, really, it could be anyone's suitcase. They could just have lied about what was in it. But we have to trust the person that's telling us all the facts and stuff. So I'm gonna say that the one that they end up with in the end is Miss Peacock's. So, how does that work? Well, the only way it could work is if Mrs. Peacock switched suitcases with Mr. Green back in the beginning. So we don't even have to do the process of elimination, because it would be freaking obvious. I really think it's Mrs. Peacock. Okay, so that's what I think the solution to who stole Mr. Green's suitcase is. I think Mrs. Peacock did it. But I would like to hear what your guys' explanations are. So be sure to post a comment down below saying who you think stole Mr. Green's suitcase. Okay? Please pause the video while you do that so you don't get any spoilers. Okay? Okay, now's your last chance. Okay, I'm gonna read the solution now. Okay, solution. Mrs. Peacock. I thought so. Okay. After the first swap, we don't know what's in Mr. Green's suitcase, but we can keep track of it. Professor Plum took Mr. Green's new bag. When he bumped into Mrs. White, who took his bag by mistake. So then she had the telltale bag. When Mr. Green opened his bag, he found the blue mouthwash. What means that means that the unknown guest who made the first swap with Mr. Green had mouthwash in his or her bag. There are 6 identical suitcases. We know what's in every suitcase but one. Mrs. Peacock refused to say what was in her bag because she thought it wasn't proper. Mrs. Peacock was embarrassed to discuss mouthwash in public. Why? That's weird. But she wasn't embarrassed to steal Mr. Green's bonds. So, yeah, so if you guys commented Mrs. Peacock down below, congratulations, you did it right, yeah. So I got it right, that's good. And, yeah. So let's get on to Chapter 2. Chapter 2. Cut down to size. Ah! Sighed Mr. Body. Now this is the... Oh. Why'd you put it in all caps? I thought he was, like, gonna get shot or... was being shot or something. Don't put all in caps if you don't want it to be a scream. Now this is the life. He was lounging in the lounge, of course, in his bathrobe. His slippery feet rested on a soft footrest. In one hand, he held a section of the Sunday Little Falls Gazette. In the other hand, he held a steaming mug of coffee filled to the brim, playing on the recorder his favorite song, Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. For the moment, everything was perfect. "Good morning, Mr. Body," sang his maid. Mrs. White was, as she bustled into the room in a white bathrobe. She was smiling broadly. "More coffee?" "Yes, thank you," mumbled Body. Mrs. White poured, smirking slyly. Body let out a scream, since there was no room left in the already full cup. The extra coffee had poured all over his hand. "Sorry," said Mrs. White, scowling. "How stupid of me." But when Mr. Body went back to reading, her scowl changed to a smile. She bustled out. "Reginald, darling!" exclaimed Miss Scarlet as she sailed into the room. She was wearing red silk pajamas and clutching a bright red teddy bear. She stretched like a cat, yawned and screamed. "Ah!" Mr. Body threw his paper up in the air. "Sorry," said Miss Scarlet with a laugh. "Just clearing my throat." "Oh, well, that's all right. Make yourself at home." Mr. Body returned to reading. "Oh my, what a beautiful morning!" Miss Scarlet rushed across the room and flung the windows wide open. The cool breeze started turning the pages of the paper in Body's hand. Perhaps we shouldn't open the window quite so wide, Miss Scarlet," Mr. Body said. "I'm feeling a bit—" Miss Scarlet turned and screamed at the top of her lungs. I'll spare you guys. I'll spare you headphone users the Foley on that one. "You know, Miss Scarlet, perhaps you should drink something. I find that when I have a tickle in my throat, the—" "You scoundrel!" cried Miss Scarlet. She reached into the pocket of her pajamas and pulled out a knife. "Oh, what did I do this time?" asked her confused host. Miss Scarlet was slowly coming closer. She held the knife over Body's head. Then she stabbed. But she didn't stab Mr. Body. She was stabbing the newspaper. She was cutting out a clipping. Miss Scarlet," Mr. Body began. "I'm still reading the paper, actually." "I only want this wedding announcement," Miss Scarlet exclaimed. "John Harrisburg is an old flame of mine. The traitor!" Mr. Body kept professing, but to no avail, and just then Mr. Green shuffled into the room in his celery green bathrobe and lime green slippers. Is it always going to be food analogies for his clothes? I'm just asking. He rubbed his eyes, then shrieked, "Coupons!" He took out a knife and started stabbing Bobby's paper as well. Does nobody use scissors anymore? Just asking. Then Colonel Mustard ran into the room, did 20 jumping jacks, beat his breast 10 times, and yodeled. Hallelujah! He sang, "I'm up!" Then he saw Miss Scarlet and Mr. Green stabbing Mr. Body's paper. He moved closer. "Duel in the sun!" he shouted. He pulled out a knife and joined the stabbing as he tried to cut out the movie listings. It's getting crowded over there. Plum was next, in his purple bathrobe. "Memory aids!" he gasped, peering at the newspaper. "I've been meaning to order these tapes, but I keep forgetting." Okay, that's pretty funny. He used his knife to cut out the ads. "I hope you're cutting out all the dirty words," puffed Mrs. Peacock. Then she saw what was going on. She started using her knife to cut out the dirty words. Words such as slime, sludge, and filth, slipping and clipping into the pocket of her blue robe. "Stop! Stop!" begged Mr. Body. "Mrs. White!" he cried as his maid entered the room. "Please help!" Instead, Mrs. White pulled out a knife and began cutting out the household hints article entitled 30 Uses for... Am I reading that right? 30 uses for arsenic around the home. Well, everyone out! "Why, Mr. Body?" said Miss Scarlet. "I've never heard you raise your voice that way." Yep, that's true. All the guests agreed. Then they all went back to stabbing the paper. Finally, they were done. The guests filed out of the room, studying their clippings. At last, all was quiet. Mr. Body looked at the paper in his hands. It now looked like Swiss cheese. His heart was pounding. Mr. Body gritted his teeth. Then he took a deep breath. Slowly, he began to calm down. 10 minutes later, he was absorbed in his paper, humming happily along with the song "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star." He began to sing to himself. "How I wonder why Miss Scarlet is screaming." Mr. Body put his paper down. "Why is Miss Scarlet screaming?" "Mr. Body!" gasped Mrs. White, running into the room. "Miss Scarlet just found Colonel Mustard in the ballroom. He's been murdered! Dun dun dun! I so called it." Drop pen. I so called it when I said that one of the suspects should be murdered just to, switch things up. Wait, that means Mr. Body is a suspect in this case. Well, actually, no, he isn't, because he has an alibi. You can't be in two places at one time, so... Well, I guess, in theory, he could have somehow stabbed him while he was stabbing the newspaper. But then, I feel like we would have witnesses. Well, anyway. In the ballroom, Colonel Mustard sat slumped in a chair, his copy of the Sunday paper draped over his lifeless body. "He's been stabbed with a knife!" "Oh, he's been stabbed with a knife," said Mr. Green, after examining the colonel's wounds. "How rude," said Mrs. Peacock. Just then, Mr. Body rushed into the room, followed by Mrs. White. Mr. Body took one look at the corpse, then covered his face with his hands and began to blubber. Who would do such a wonderful, horrible thing?" gasped Mrs. White. "Don't look at me," said Miss Scarlet. All right, said Professor Plum. He turned and gazed at the wall. He was probably looking at her already. "Well," said Mrs. Peacock, "I know one thing. The murderer is in this room." "Yeah, thanks, Captain Obvious." "But who had a motive?" asked Green. "Yes, good question," said Miss Scarlet. "Who hated mustard?" "I've always thought it was good on hot dogs." I was literally just thinking, how can I make a food pun out of that? I could write this stuff, mumbled Plum. Mr. Body, meanwhile, was pulling the papers off Mustard's body. Will you look at that?" said Mrs. White. "I guess nothing can keep Mr. Body from reading his Sunday papers." "Quiet," said Mr. Body. He flipped through the newspapers briskly. There were pieces cut out of the wedding page, household hints, and the food coupons page. Okay, wedding page, that was Scarlet. Household hints, that was the maid. And food coupons, I believe that was Mr. Green, because he's the flat broke one, I think. Yeah, Mr. Green is the one that's flat broke now. "Sure," said Mrs. White. That's what's important. For us to be quiet while you read your paper. Never mind that a man's been killed and his murderer is on the loose. Not on the loose," said Body slowly. "The killer is indeed in this room, and I know from my own recent experience how this murder occurred. It was an accident, you see." "An accident?" "An accident?" Mrs. Peacock chuckled. "Oh, Mr. Body, you're so trusting. Who would walk up to the colonel and stab him in the chest by accident?" Someone who wanted to cut out a clipping from Mustard's paper in the most dramatic way possible, I might add. Do you not... all this money and they don't have scissors? Seriously? Crazy kooks. Said Body, holding up the shredded newspaper. Apparently the murderer slipped while he or her clipped, and he gestured to the colonel. "This is the terrible result." Meanwhile, Mr. Green was scrolling casually towards the door. "Going somewhere?" Miss Scarlet asked him. "Yes," I'd love to stick around, but I've got an important business appointment. Mr. Body crossed the room and locked the door. No one's leaving this room, he said. Not until you let me see those knives of yours. All the guests took out their knives. Mr. Body studied them closely. He said, disappointed. Not a trace of blood on any one of them. There goes that theory, said Plum. Not necessarily, said Mr. Body. The killer must have wiped the knife off on his or her robe. Everyone stared closely at everyone else's robe. At first glance, there didn't appear to be blood on anyone's clothes. In that case, said Mr. Body. In that case, said Mr. Body, I will now name the murderer. Okay, comment section. Who do you think killed Colonel Mustard? Personally, I think it's Scarlet. Even though red's my favorite color, the evidence is great amount her. First of all, she was the one cutting up the wedding page because he was a previous boyfriend of hers. And second of all, she was wearing red pajamas, which would make it hard to spot at first. And obviously, that's what we're going for, is red pajamas. Because they say at a first glance, you wouldn't notice the blood on their PJs. And also, she was really angry when she was cutting it, so she probably was getting really reckless with her cutting. And also, does nobody use scissors anymore? Seriously, they're all freaking rich, and they never even thought to use scissors. They're all like, oh, I'm going to stab this newspaper. It's just not very realistic. Can I just say that? Okay. Have you all posted who you think is the murderer down in the comments section? I hope so, because I'm about to reveal. And the solution is Miss Scarlet in the ballroom with the knife. The 3 clippings from Mustard's paper narrow our list down to 3 suspects: green, white, and scarlet. No blood was readily visible on anyone's pajamas. Only Miss Scarlet's red silk pajamas would hide the tall tale clue. They keep using that word. I don't know what it means. I think it means the highest ranking. That's at least based on how they're using it. That's what my guess is. By the way, after the guests solved the mystery, it occurred to them to call a doctor. The doctor arrived in time to save Colonel. Because they have to save Colonel, because he's a main character, and because if they do this, then too much will be changed by this book for them to, if they ever have to get a random other writer to write the books, then they can do it. I'm not saying that they do that, but given what I've read thus far of this book, I get the feeling that it's written in the same kind of way as a series, where at the end of each book they have to come up with a way to make things go. At the end of each segment in the book, they have to figure out a way to make things as they were at the beginning of the books, so no one can really die. So even when someone is quote unquote murdered, they won't actually disappear from the series because they can't do that. So that's my 2 cents on that. Alright. How much time have we been recording? I think that's a good place to stop for now. So I will see you guys next time when we read more of Clue, the Case of the Invisible Cat, which is really more a collection of mini stories as it stands now. But time will tell if they have an overall story or not, which I really don't think they're going to. I think it's just going to be like a collection of mini stories. But either way, I'm having a really fun time reading this and trying to figure out who done what. And I will see you guys next time on dramatic readings and